Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head on UATV. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Today we're going to talk about another scandalous judicial decision. It's about the precautionary measures for Vladyslav Kaskiv, the former director of the Ukrainian State Agency for Investment and National Projects, who is suspected of embezzling $1 million of public funds in 2012 currency rate. He was extradited all the way from Panama to Ukraine in order to get released on the bail of almost $6,000 at present currency rate. To discuss the issue, we are joined in the studio by Maksym Kostetskyi. He is legal advisor to Transparency International Ukraine. Hello and thank you for coming.
Good day.
So, Mr. Kostetskyi, what is your take on Kaskiv's case?
Well, first of all, I would like to emphasize that this is the first case of extradition of a former high-ranking official from a foreign country to Ukraine since 2013.
Was it ever expected to happen, this extradition, as a process in Ukraine?
Actually, since in 2016, almost all former high-ranking officials have been removed from the Interpol list. The expectations were quite low because nobody actually expected that the prosecutor's office would actually do something to get these officials back to Ukraine. And this precedent case is actually a good success for the prosecutor's office of Ukraine, of course. First of all, Mr. Kaskiv used to be a head of a state agency on investments and national projects, which was supposed to be a really big infrastructure project. If I'm not mistaken, they were planning to establish at least 10 mega infrastructural projects in Ukraine, none of which were basically done, but money on which were spent. Yes. And but the only part of the money that was actually taken into account by the prosecutor's office is only $1 million, and basically the amount was a lot more bigger than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's suspected of embezzling $1 million in the rate of 2012, and now the bail is just $6,000. How fair is the decision?
Well, of course, comparing to what damage he has done to the state budget, the amount of bail is rather small. I mean, it's 160,000 Ukrainian hryvnias or $6,000. But there are two issues that we need to take into account here. First of all, his lawyers provided an official statement that he has reimbursed all the financial damage that was made to the state budget, which means that he has reimbursed 7.5 million hryvnias. In present currency rate, if I'm not mistaken. And more than that, he has 5 minor children at home, and according to our criminal procedural law, the court had to take that into account in order to measure what amount of bail they should press on it.
Yeah, but still the person violated the law. And how do you think, does this mean that the case proceedings are not being carried out adequately by the Prosecutor's General Office of Ukraine?
Well, I believe that it's a little early to say whether or not they have a good evidence base for this case, because we don't know whether or not how this court proceedings is going to go. First of all, it is a success for the prosecutor's office to have Mr. Kaskiv extradited from Panama, but after this preliminary court decision where the measure on indictment, measure on whether or not he was going to spend the pre-court trial, a pre-court period of time in jail or outside paying the bail, was for the court to decide and not for the prosecutor's office to do. And afterwards, we'll see how the prosecutors will work in the court decisions, because it is really extremely important that the procedural documents and all the evidence they have collected is really perfect, and it would take into account all the different aspects that would make sure that Mr. Kaskiv is going to be basically tried fairly in the court.
Are there any ways Kaskiv can benefit from such court's decision?
Nowadays, well,
to avoid the sentence, for example.
Well, I wouldn't say that there is a point for him to leave the country right now, because first of all, he was officially extradited, and if he is in any way unofficially leaving the country, he would most definitely be arrested again. unless he is going to go to some country like Russian Federation, where we cannot have those ex-top officials extradited back to Ukraine. However, it is good for him to, well, maybe finally be back home after all these years and get ready for the court proceedings, of course, because his lawyers need to do a really good job in order to protect their client. And this is an opportunity for Mr. Kaskiv to prove that whether or not he is or he is not guilty.
And also he was obliged to hand over all his available passports, but how possible is it to hide the amount of passport that person has?
Well, unfortunately, it is a job of State Security Service to know whether or not a person has citizenship of another country. And if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Kaskiv is said to have a citizenship of Panama, which is why he was basically going to there. But unfortunately, State Security Service does not necessarily know whether or not he has any passports of foreign countries, and all they can do is to take out all the Ukrainian passports he has in order to make sure that he does not leave country in any official way possible. And this is one measure that is taken in order to make sure that Mr. Kaskiv does not leave the country again, of course.
Well, if we had an anti-corruption court existing and working on this case, how would you expect this process develop?
Well, first of all, we as Transparency International are extremely interested in a fair and objective court trial for all the top officials, and as for this government and for the last government that was 3 years ago. But in order to make sure that the court proceedings and the final decisions of the court are actually fair and objective, we need to have a fair and impartial and independent court system. Unfortunately, we cannot say this as in regard to our existing courts. First of all, the Solomensky or Pechersky or any other district courts in Kiev, which are most usually trying these corrupted officials, they are understaffed and they do not have either enough judges and enough time, and they are subject to political influence, which means that we cannot necessarily expect fair and impartial decision at there. If high anti-corruption court were to be established, the process would be much more sufficient, much more effective and faster, because this court would have a sole jurisdiction over the grand corruption cases, which means that all the cases that were subject to National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine would go directly to this high anti-corruption court, and the judges would deal only with these cases, which means that they would not be backed down and laid in the pile of different cases of insurance or civic cases, any other thing. Which means that the high anti-corruption court of Ukraine would be a great benefit in the fight against corruption in Ukraine. And this institution is extremely important for Ukraine to finally get on the top of corruption.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but thank you so much for these interesting comments.
Thank you for inviting me.
Today we spoke with Maksym Kostetskyi, legal advisor to Transparency International Ukraine. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Goodbye.